I was sitting in my car at 3 in the morning, wrapped in a hotel blanket I'd stolen from the lobby, watching my son's rehearsal dinner through the restaurant windows while texting the venue owner about purchasing his entire wedding location for twice what it was worth. That's not how I imagined spending the night before my only child's wedding. But then again, I never imagined Mark would look me straight in the eye and tell me there was no room for me at the hotel because his new bride's family needed all the available space, and maybe I could find somewhere nearby to stay. Maybe I could drive the 40 minutes back home. Maybe I could figure it out myself because he had more important things to worry about than where his mother slept the night before his wedding. The thing is, when you spend 32 years raising a child by yourself, working double shifts as a nurse to pay for his college, his car, his apartment deposits, his engagement ring, when you sacrifice everything including your own chance at love because you wanted to give him the stable family you never had, you don't expect to end up homeless in a hotel parking lot while his future in-laws get the royal treatment in rooms you helped pay for. But here I was, 61 years old, distinguished silver hair probably looking like I'd stuck my finger in an electrical socket, wearing the navy dress I'd carefully chosen for the rehearsal dinner I wasn't invited to, conducting business on my phone at 3 in the morning that would change everything. Mark had always been a thoughtful child. I remember when he was 7, he used to bring me dandelions from the yard because he thought they were as pretty as the roses we couldn't afford. When he was 12 and I was working Christmas Eve at the hospital, he wrapped all his little drawings for me and put them under our scraggly tree with a note that said, "For Mom who works too hard." He used to tell people his mom was a hero because I saved lives for a living. Somewhere along the way that changed. Maybe it started in high school when he became embarrassed that we lived in a small apartment while his friends had houses. Maybe it was in college when he realized other kids had trust funds and European vacations while he had work-study jobs and community college transfers to save money. Or maybe it was when he met Clarissa. Clarissa Wellington Pierce. Yes, that's really her name with the hyphen and everything. She's 26 to Mark's 28, blonde in that expensive way that requires monthly appointments, and has never worked a day in her life because her daddy owns half the commercial real estate in the county. She speaks in this breathy little girl voice that makes everything sound like a suggestion rather than a demand, which somehow makes her demands even more impossible to refuse. The first time Mark brought her home to our little apartment, she walked through our living room touching things like she was touring a museum of poverty. "Oh, this is so authentic," she said about the coffee table I'd bought at a garage sale and refinished myself. "It's like so real how normal people live," she said. Normal people. The way you might say exotic animals. But Mark was smitten, absolutely gone for her. And if I'm being honest, I understood why. She was beautiful in that untouchable way. And she had this life of ease that probably seemed magical to a boy who'd watched his mother count pennies and work overtime just to keep the lights on. She represented everything he'd never had. Everything I'd never been able to give him. I tried to like her. God knows I tried. When she mentioned she'd never had a home-cooked meal that wasn't prepared by staff, I invited her for dinner and spent a week's grocery budget on ingredients for a roast that she picked at while explaining that her trainer had her on a very specific eating plan. When she commented that our apartment was cozy in that tone that really meant cramped, I started looking at houses I couldn't afford, wondering if I could somehow manage a down payment to give Mark something to be proud of. But nothing I did was ever enough. And worse, Mark started seeing our life through her eyes. Suddenly our traditions were embarrassing. The Christmas morning where we'd always made pancakes together and exchanged modest gifts became so middle class according to Clarissa, who suggested they spend the holiday in Aspen instead. Our movie nights became inconvenient when she wanted to attend gallery openings and charity functions where I clearly wouldn't fit in. The engagement happened fast. One day Mark was my son who called me every Sunday and came over for dinner twice a week, and the next he was planning a life that seemed to have no room for the woman who'd raised him. The wedding planning was a nightmare from the start. "The thing is, Mrs. Peters," Clarissa explained to me over lunch at a restaurant where the salads cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week, "weddings are really about the bride's family, you know? Like, traditionally my family is hosting so they get to make the decisions about guest lists and venues and things. It's not personal, it's just how these things work. How these things work. As if weddings were some complex corporate merger instead of a celebration of love. As if the groom's mother was just an inconvenient detail to be managed rather than the woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise the man her daughter was marrying. Of course, I said, stirring my coffee and trying to ignore the way she talked about me like I wasn't sitting right there. I just want Mark to be happy. Oh, he will be, she assured me with that bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. We're going to give him such a better life. Expose him to culture, help him network with the right people. He has so much potential that just hasn't been developed yet. Developed? Like Mark was some kind of raw material that needed refinement. Like everything I'd taught him about kindness and hard work and integrity was just rough edges that needed to be smoothed away. The guest list was the first real battle. I'd given Mark a list of 40 people. Family, friends, neighbors who'd watched him grow up, my coworkers who'd celebrated every milestone with us, the handful of relatives I still spoke to. Mom, he said, not meeting my eyes, we need to keep it small. Intimate. Just immediate family and close friends. These are close friends, I said. Mrs. Rodriguez has been like a grandmother to you since you were 5. She taught you to make tamales, remember? And the Johnsons from next door. They helped with your homework every day when I was working late. That's not really Clarissa's crowd, he said, and there it was. The division. Clarissa's crowd and everyone else. Everyone else included me, apparently. In the end, I was allowed to invite 12 people. 12. Out of the hundreds of guests who would be celebrating the wedding I was paying for. Because yes, despite all of Clarissa's talk about her family hosting, when it came time for actual money, suddenly there were expectations. Mark sat me down 6 months before the wedding with a look on his face like he was about to ask me to donate a kidney. Mom, we need to talk about the financial arrangements, he said, pulling out a folder of papers that I later realized Clarissa had prepared. The Wellington Pierces are handling the reception and most of the ceremony costs, but they're expecting the groom's family to contribute their fair share. Their fair share turned out to be $40,000. $40,000 for flowers and music and upgrading the bar service and covering the cost of transportation for out-of-town guests. $40,000 that represented my entire retirement savings, the money I'd been carefully putting away for 20 years so I wouldn't be a burden to Mark in my old age. I know it's a lot, Mark said, reaching across the table to pat my hand like I was a confused elderly relative instead of the woman who'd worked herself to the bone to raise him. But this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. And think about it as an investment in our future. The connections Clarissa's family has, the opportunities this could open up for me. It could change everything. Change everything. He was right about that, though not in the way he imagined. I said yes, of course. I liquidated my retirement account, paid the penalties, and handed over every penny I'd saved for my future because I wanted my son to be happy. I wanted him to have the wedding of his dreams, even if those dreams seemed to have been entirely shaped by someone else. But paying for it didn't buy me any influence over the planning. Every suggestion I made was politely dismissed. The church where I'd hoped Mark would get married, the same church where I'd brought him every Sunday when he was small, where he'd been confirmed, where I'd prayed for guidance during the hardest years of single motherhood, wasn't grand enough. Instead, they chose St. Catherine's Cathedral downtown, the one with the marble columns and the society photographer, the one where you had to know someone important just to book a date. The reception venue was Willowbrook Manor, a sprawling estate that looked like something from a movie, with gardens and fountains and a ballroom that could seat 300. It was beautiful, I'll give them that. It was also completely impersonal. The kind of place where you could get married and divorced and remarried without anyone noticing because money made everything look the same. When I suggested maybe having the reception at the country club where my coworkers and I sometimes went for special occasions, a nice place, respectable, somewhere my friends would feel comfortable, Clarissa actually laughed. Oh, Mrs. Peters, she said. That's so sweet, but we really need somewhere more appropriate for the kind of event we're planning. Appropriate. Everything I wanted was inappropriate. The music I liked was too old-fashioned. The flowers I preferred were too common. The food I suggested was too ethnic. Even my dress for the wedding required Clarissa's approval, and after 3 shopping trips and a dozen rejections, we finally settled on something in dusty rose that she deemed acceptable for the mother of the groom. The worst part was watching Mark go along with all of it. This was the boy I'd raised to stand up for what was right, to defend people who couldn't defend themselves, to value kindness over status. But every time I tried to talk to him about how his wedding planning was making me feel, he'd get this trapped look in his eyes and mumble something about how Clarissa knew about these things better than we did, how important it was to do everything properly. "She loves me, Mom," he said one afternoon when I'd suggested maybe we could have one dance to Brown Eyed Girl, the song I used to sing to him when he was little, the song that always made him smile. "And I love her. Can't you just be happy for me?" Of course I could be happy for him. The question was whether he could be happy with himself after turning into someone I barely recognized. 3 weeks before the wedding, I was finally allowed to see the seating chart. My 12 guests, my 12 people in a sea of 300 strangers, were seated at a table in the very back of the ballroom, behind a pillar that would block our view of the ceremony. My own table, as mother of the groom, was positioned behind the wedding party but in front of the general guests, far enough from the head table that I'd need binoculars to see my son's face during dinner. "It's all very carefully planned," Clarissa explained when I asked about the arrangements. "There's a whole science to wedding seating. You can't just put people wherever. No, apparently you put them exactly where they rank in your personal hierarchy of importance. And I rank somewhere below her daddy's golf partners and her sorority sisters and people she'd met exactly once at charity functions. But I accepted it all. I smiled and nodded and wrote the checks and tried to convince myself that this was what modern weddings were like, that I was just too old-fashioned to understand. I told myself that once they were married and settled, Mark would remember who he really was, would find his way back to the values I tried to teach him. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be lies. The real wake-up call came 2 days before the wedding. I'd driven down to help with last-minute preparations, expecting to spend time with Mark, maybe have one of our old heart-to-heart conversations before he became a married man. Instead, I found myself essentially working as unpaid help, running errands and handling details while Clarissa directed the proceedings like a military campaign. "Mrs. Peters," she called out as I was arranging programs on the gift table, "could you run to the hotel and make sure my bridesmaids have everything they need? And maybe pick up some of those little safety pins in case anyone has a wardrobe emergency? Oh, and we need more bottled water for the bridal suite, the fancy kind, not just regular water." I spent the day driving back and forth, fetching sparkling water and emergency lipstick and special hangers for the bridesmaids' dresses, while Mark was whisked away for his bachelor party, a golf outing followed by dinner at the country club, an event I wasn't invited to despite being the one who taught him to play golf in the first place. That evening, tired and feeling more like hired help than family, I approached Mark about our accommodations for the night. The whole wedding party was staying at the Grand Harbor Hotel, a luxury property right next to the venue. I'd assumed I'd be staying there too, had been looking forward to having breakfast with Mark the morning of his wedding, maybe helping him with his tie the way I used to when he was nervous about school presentations. "Oh, Mom," Mark said, barely looking up from his phone where he was coordinating tomorrow's timeline with Clarissa's wedding planner. "Yeah, about that. There's been a change of plans." A change of plans. The phrase that had become the soundtrack to my entire experience with this wedding. "The thing is," he continued, still not meeting my eyes, "Clarissa's family needed more rooms than we originally thought. Her cousins from California, and her dad's business partners, and there's this whole situation with her grandmother needing a suite instead of a regular room. The hotel is completely booked." I waited for him to explain where I was supposed to stay, how he'd solved this problem for his mother, the woman who'd raised him and paid for his wedding. "You could drive home tonight and come back in the morning," he suggested. "It's only 40 minutes. Or maybe find somewhere nearby to stay. Maybe find somewhere nearby to stay." Like I was some random wedding guest he barely knew instead of the woman who'd given him life and spent 32 years making sure he had everything he needed. "Mark," I said, keeping my voice steady because I'd learned over the years that getting emotional only made him shut down. "It's the night before your wedding. I wanted to be here with you." "I know, Mom, and I appreciate that, but things are just really complicated right now. Clarissa's really stressed about tomorrow. And her family has certain expectations about how things should be handled. You understand, right?" No, I didn't understand. I didn't understand how the woman who'd sacrificed everything for him could be treated like an inconvenience on the most important day of his life. I didn't understand how he could look me in the eye and ask me to drive 40 minutes home so that strangers could have the hotel rooms I'd helped pay for. But what I said was, "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you need." Because that's what I'd been saying for 32 years. Whatever you need. Even when what he needed was for me to disappear. So I found myself at 10 o'clock at night driving around a town I barely knew, looking for somewhere to stay. The first 3 hotels I tried were booked solid. Apparently there was some kind of medical conference in addition to the wedding weekend. The 4th place had a room, but when I saw the condition of the lobby and the way the clerk looked at me when I asked about security, I decided I'd rather sleep in my car. Which is exactly what I ended up doing. I parked in the lot of the Grand Harbor Hotel where my son was sleeping peacefully in a suite I'd helped pay for, surrounded by people who thought I wasn't important enough to deserve basic consideration. I reclined my driver's seat as far as it would go, wrapped myself in the emergency blanket I kept in my trunk, and tried to sleep while listening to the sound of Clarissa's bridesmaids laughing and drinking champagne on the balcony 3 floors above me. That's when I started thinking about the venue. I'd been to Willowbrook Manor 3 times during the planning process, had walked through those beautiful rooms and gardens while Clarissa pointed out all the features that made it so much more appropriate than anywhere I'd suggested. It was gorgeous, I'll admit that. But it was also a business and businesses could be bought. So there I was at 3 in the morning sitting in my car, looking up the property records for Willowbrook Manor on my phone, while my son slept in luxury upstairs. The owner was a man named Harold Pemberton, and according to the real estate sites I found, he'd been trying to sell the property for 2 years. The asking price was $28 million, which was more money than I'd ever imagined having access to. But here's the thing about working in healthcare for 35 years and living below your means, you learn things about money that other people don't know. You learn about investment accounts and property values, and how to make your savings work for you. And you learn about life insurance policies, especially when you're a single mother who needs to make sure your child will be taken care of if something happens to you. When Mark's father walked out on us when Mark was 2, I did 2 things. I increased my life insurance policy to $500,000, and I started investing every spare penny I could find. Not in some fancy portfolio managed by expensive advisors, but in simple index funds and municipal bonds and real estate investment trusts that steadily, quietly grew over 30 years. By the time Mark graduated college, I had $12 million in various accounts. By the time he got engaged, it was $18 million. I'd never touched it because I'd always assumed it would go to Mark someday, would help him buy his first house or start his own family or maybe send his children to college without the struggle I'd faced. But sitting in that car, cold and tired and finally understanding exactly how little I meant to the son I'd sacrificed everything for, I started thinking about those accounts differently. I started thinking about what justice might look like when it was backed by enough money to make it real. Harold Pemberton answered his phone on the 3rd ring, even though it was 3:30 in the morning. When you're trying to sell a $28 million property, and someone calls offering $32 million in cash with a closing within 48 hours, you take the call. Mr. Pemberton, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My name is Eleanor Peters and I'm interested in purchasing Willowbrook Manor. I understand there's a wedding scheduled there tomorrow that I'd like to discuss. It took 6 hours of phone calls, 2 lawyers, 1 very confused bank manager, and a wire transfer that made my financial advisor call me 3 times to confirm I hadn't been kidnapped. But by 9 o'clock the next morning, as Mark was probably eating the room service breakfast I'd helped pay for, I owned the venue where he was supposed to get married in 8 hours. The first person I called was Clarissa. "Mrs. Peters?" she said, and I could hear the surprise in her voice. Clarissa never called me unless she needed something, and I was supposed to be 40 minutes away, safely out of the way until it was time for pictures. "Hello, dear," I said, standing in the main lobby of Willowbrook Manor while Harold Pemberton's staff stared at me like I was some kind of alien species. "I'm calling about the wedding today." "Oh, good," she said, and I could hear her moving around, probably getting ready for all the beauty treatments that would take up her morning. "Did you find somewhere to stay last night?" I felt so bad about the hotel situation, but you know how these things are. No, I thought, I really don't know how these things are. I don't know how you look at the woman who raised your fiancé and decide she's not worth basic consideration. I don't know how you take her money and then treat her like an inconvenience. I don't know how you do any of this with a clear conscience. But what I said was, I found somewhere to stay, thank you. The reason I'm calling is that there's been a change of plans regarding the venue. A change of plans? Her voice got that sharp edge it always had when something threatened to disrupt her carefully orchestrated vision. What kind of change? Everything was confirmed yesterday. Well, I said, looking around at the ballroom where her wedding was supposed to take place in a few hours, I've purchased Willowbrook Manor. As of this morning, I own the property. There was a long silence. Then, I'm sorry, what? I bought the venue, Clarissa. All of it. The manor, the grounds, the gardens, everything. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to cancel today's event. Another silence, longer this time. I could almost hear her trying to process this information, trying to figure out if I was joking or having some kind of breakdown. You can't do that, she said finally. We have a contract. We have 300 guests coming. You can't just buy a venue and cancel a wedding. Actually, I said, consulting the papers my lawyer had prepared, I can. The previous owner included a clause in our purchase agreement that allows me to terminate any existing contracts with 72 hours notice. I'm giving you 8 hours notice, which is more than you gave me when you decided I wasn't important enough to have a place to sleep last night. Mrs. Peters, she said, and now her voice was getting shrill, losing that breathy little girl quality that usually made her sound so harmless. You're being completely unreasonable. This is Mark's wedding day. You can't destroy your own son's wedding. I'm not destroying anything, I said calmly. I'm simply exercising my rights as the new owner of this property. Of course, we could discuss alternative arrangements. What kind of alternative arrangements? And there it was, the opening I'd been waiting for. The moment when Clarissa Wellington Pierce, who'd spent the last year treating me like an inconvenience, realized that inconveniences sometimes have more power than you think. Well, I said, I'd be willing to allow the wedding to proceed as planned, but there would need to be some changes to the arrangements. What changes? First, I'd like a proper apology from both you and Mark for the way I've been treated throughout this process. A real apology, not the fake politeness you've been giving me for the last year. I could hear her breathing, probably trying to decide whether to hang up on me or scream. Fine, she said finally. What else? Second, the seating arrangements need to be corrected. My guests will be moved to the front, and I'll be seated at the head table where the mother of the groom belongs. The head table is just for the wedding party. Then make room. It's my venue now. Another pause. What else? Third, we're going to have that dance to Brown-Eyed Girl that you vetoed. It was Mark's favorite song when he was little, and we're going to dance to it. Our playlist is already set. The DJ works for me now. What else I want is very simple, Clarissa. I want to be treated like family instead of hired help. I want basic respect and consideration. I want to feel welcome at my own son's wedding instead of like an inconvenient obligation you're trying to manage. The silence stretched out so long I thought she might have hung up. Finally, she said, and if we agree to these changes, you'll let the wedding happen. I will. In fact, I'll do more than that. I'll make sure it's the most beautiful wedding this venue has ever hosted. But it will be on my terms, not yours. I need to talk to Mark. Of course you do. You have 15 minutes to decide. And then I start making calls to your guests to let them know the wedding has been canceled. I hung up before she could respond, and then I sat down in one of the velvet chairs in the lobby to wait. Through the windows, I could see the catering staff arriving to set up for the reception, the florist carrying in arrangements that cost more than most people's cars, the wedding planner rushing around with her clipboard and her headset, managing the kind of elaborate production that Clarissa had insisted was necessary for a proper wedding. It was beautiful, I'll give her that. But it was also completely hollow. A performance designed to impress people rather than celebrate love. Nothing about it reflected Mark or the man I'd raised him to be. Nothing about it honored the family that had brought him to this moment. But that was about to change. My phone rang 12 minutes later. Mark. Mom, he said, and his voice was tight with something between panic and anger. What the hell are you doing? I'm standing up for myself, I said. Something I should have done a long time ago. You bought Clarissa's wedding venue? You bought the entire venue to ruin my wedding. I bought it to save your wedding, I corrected. From becoming something you'll be ashamed of someday. What are you talking about? Mark, when did you become the kind of person who lets his mother sleep in her car so that strangers can have hotel rooms? When did you become someone who takes $40,000 from the woman who raised him, and then treats her like she doesn't matter? Mom, When did you become someone who's ashamed of where he comes from instead of proud of how far he's come? There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I'm not ashamed of you. Then why have I been treated like an embarrassment for the last year? Why have all of my suggestions been rejected? Why am I seated behind a pillar at your wedding? Why wasn't there room for me at the hotel last night? It's complicated, Mom. Clarissa's family has certain expectations. And what about my expectations? I interrupted. What about the expectations of the woman who worked double shifts to pay for your college? What about the expectations of the woman who gave up dating and traveling and buying herself nice things so that you could have everything you needed? Don't I get to have any expectations? Another pause. Then, what do you want? I want what I've always wanted. I want my son back. The one who used to bring me dandelions and tell people I was a hero. The one who understood that treating people with kindness was more important than impressing them with money. I'm still that person. No, Mark, you're not. That person would never have let me sleep in my car. That person would have fought for me instead of making excuses for people who treated me badly. I could hear him talking to someone in the background, probably Clarissa. Their voices tense and urgent. When he came back to the phone, he sounded tired. Mom, please. Just let us have our wedding. We'll fix the seating chart, we'll make sure you're comfortable. But please don't do this. It's already done, I said. The question now is whether you want to get married in a beautiful venue with your mother present and respected, or whether you want to spend your wedding day explaining to 300 guests why there's no wedding. This is blackmail. No, I said. This is consequences. For the first time in your life, you're facing actual consequences for treating someone badly. How does it feel? There was a long silence, and then he hung up. 20 minutes later, Clarissa called back. We accept your terms, she said, her voice flat and cold. All of them. All of them. And the apology. Another pause. We'll apologize at the reception. In front of everyone. That's not what I asked for. It's what you're getting. Take it or leave it. I considered this. A public apology was actually better than a private one. It would make their change in attitude official, would establish new ground rules in front of all their friends and family. Acceptable, I said. I'll see you at the church. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful, I'll admit that. St. Catherine's Cathedral really was stunning. All marble and stained glass and soaring ceilings that made you feel like you were in the presence of something holy. Mark looked handsome in his tuxedo, nervous but happy, and Clarissa was radiant in her designer gown that probably cost more than my car. I sat in the front row where the mother of the groom belonged, wearing my dusty rose dress and my grandmother's pearls, watching my son promise to love and honor a woman who I wasn't sure was capable of either. But he was happy, genuinely happy, and that had always been what mattered most to me. The reception, though, was where things got interesting. When we arrived at Willowbrook Manor, there were some noticeable changes from the original plan. My 12 guests were now seated at a table right in front of the head table, where they could see and hear everything. Mrs. Rodriguez was crying happy tears and kept telling anyone who would listen that she'd known Mark since he was this high, and had always known he'd grow up to be special. The Johnsons were taking pictures of everything, amazed to be part of such an elegant event. I was seated at the head table, right between Mark and his best man, where I could actually see my son's face during dinner instead of watching from the back of the room. Clarissa sat on his other side, smiling her perfect smile and playing the role of gracious bride. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing at me like I might do something unpredictable. When it came time for the toasts, Mark stood up with his champagne glass and looked around the room at all the faces watching him expectantly. His eyes found mine, and for just a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. Before I say anything else, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom, I need to acknowledge someone very important. My mother, Eleanor Peters. He paused, looking directly at me, and I could see him making some kind of internal decision. Most of you don't know my mom's story, he continued. You don't know that she raised me by herself from the time I was 2 years old. You don't know that she worked double shifts as a nurse, sometimes 16 hours a day, to make sure I had everything I needed. You don't know that she never dated because she wanted to focus on being the best parent she could be. And you don't know that yesterday, I let her sleep in her car because I was too worried about impressing other people to take care of the woman who spent 32 years taking care of me. There was a collective intake of breath from the guests, and I could see Clarissa's face go pale beside him. "Mom," Mark said, looking directly at me, "I am sorry. I am deeply, truly sorry for forgetting who raised me and what you taught me about treating people with respect. I am sorry for letting you down when you needed me most. And I am sorry for letting other people convince me that impressing strangers was more important than honoring the woman who made me who I am." He paused, wiping his eyes with his napkin. "The only reason this wedding is happening today is because my mother bought this entire venue to teach me a lesson I desperately needed to learn. She could have let me face the consequences of my choices. She could have let me explain to all of you why there was no wedding. Instead, she gave me a chance to do better, to be better, to remember the values she spent my whole life teaching me." He turned to Clarissa, who was sitting frozen beside him. "And Clarissa, you owe her an apology too." Clarissa stood up slowly, her face flushed but her voice steady. "Mrs. Peters," she said, looking directly at me, "I apologize for not treating you with the respect you deserve. I was so focused on having the perfect wedding that I forgot the perfect wedding is one where everyone feels valued and welcome. You raised an incredible man, and I'm lucky to be marrying him." It wasn't the most heartfelt apology I'd ever heard, but it was public and it was official, and it would do. The DJ announced the mother-son dance, and Mark walked over to offer me his arm. As we made our way to the dance floor, he leaned down and whispered. I asked him to play Brown-Eyed Girl. The opening guitar chords filled the ballroom, and suddenly I was back in our little apartment kitchen, dancing with a 5-year-old Mark while dinner cooked on the stove. He'd stand on my feet and I'd spin us around while Van Morrison sang about laughing and singing and being young, and Mark would giggle and ask me to do it again. Now he was a man in a tuxedo, dancing with his mother at his wedding reception, and he was singing along softly to the words just like he used to when he was small. "I really am sorry, Mom," he said as we swayed together in front of 300 people. "I lost myself for a while, but I'm going to do better." "I know you will," I said, because despite everything I believed it. "You're a good man, Mark. You just forgot for a little while. How did you buy this place so fast?" he asked, and I could see he was still a little stunned by the whole thing. "Turns out your old mom is full of surprises," I said. 30 years of investing adds up, especially when you're motivated by righteous indignation and access to a 24-hour banking hotline. He laughed, really laughed for the first time in months. "You spent $32 million to teach me a lesson." "I spent $32 million to save my relationship with my son," I corrected, "and to buy myself the most beautiful retirement home in the county." His eyes widened. "You're keeping it." "Of course I'm keeping it. Harold Pemberton threw in all the furniture and equipment as part of the deal. I figure I can run wedding receptions for nice families who actually treat their mothers with respect. It'll give me something to do in my golden years." The song was ending, and as Mark spun me one final time, he said, "I love you, Mom. And I'm proud to be your son." "I love you too, baby," I said, using the nickname I hadn't called him in years. "Now go dance with your wife and try to deserve her." The rest of the reception was everything a wedding should be. My friends from the hospital danced with Clarissa's sorority sisters and discovered they had more in common than anyone expected. Mrs. Rodriguez taught 3 of the groomsmen how to salsa, and the Johnsons got into a surprisingly deep conversation with Clarissa's father about vintage cars. Even Clarissa seemed to relax as the evening went on, laughing genuinely for the first time since I'd known her when one of my coworkers told embarrassing stories about Mark as a teenager. At one point, she came over to where I was sitting, watching the dancing and feeling more peaceful than I had in months. "Mrs. Peters," she said, settling into the chair beside me, "I want you to know that was the most terrifying phone call of my life." "I imagine it was," I said. "But also, maybe I needed to be terrified. I've been horrible to you, and I don't really have an excuse except that I was so focused on having everything perfect that I forgot to be a decent person." She paused, watching Mark on the dance floor with one of her bridesmaids, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, more real than I'd ever heard it. "My parents got divorced when I was 12, she said. "It was messy and awful, and they spent more time fighting about money and custody than they ever did just Being a family. I think I got so obsessed with having the perfect wedding because I wanted to prove that Mark and I were different, that we could have something beautiful and stable. Marriage isn't about the wedding, dear, I said gently. It's about what happens after the party ends. I know that now. And I know that having you in our lives is going to make our marriage stronger, not weaker. Mark is who he is because of how you raised him, and I was an idiot to think that was something to overcome instead of something to celebrate. She reached over and took my hand, and her grip was surprisingly strong. I want to do better, she said. I want to be the kind of daughter-in-law who deserves a mother-in-law like you. Will you give me a chance to try? Looking at her face, I could see something I'd never noticed before. Vulnerability hiding behind all that polish and perfection. She was just a young woman trying to figure out how to build a life, and maybe her way of doing that had been misguided, but her intentions weren't malicious. Just inexperienced. Of course, I said. But I have some conditions. She smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. I wouldn't expect anything less. What are they? First, Sunday dinners at my new house. Every other week at least. I'll cook, you and Mark will help clean up, and we'll actually talk to each other like family. Done. Second, you're going to help me figure out how to run this venue. I know about nursing and investing, but I don't know anything about event planning. You clearly have a talent for organizing beautiful parties. You want me to help you run Willowbrook Manor. I want us to run it together. As a family business. You can handle the design and client relations, I'll handle the finances and operations, and Mark can help with marketing since that's what he does for a living. She was quiet for a moment considering this. That could actually work, she said slowly. I've always loved planning events, and you're right that I don't know anything about the business side. Third, I continued, we're going to establish some ground rules about respect and communication. No more dismissing people's ideas without consideration. No more talking about people like they're not in the room. No more assuming that expensive means better. Agreed, she said immediately. Anything else? Just one more thing. I want grandchildren someday, and when that happens, they're going to know where their father came from. They're going to hear stories about his childhood and understand that their grandmother worked hard to give him opportunities. They're going to know that family loyalty goes both ways. Mrs. Peters, Clarissa said, squeezing my hand, I want our children to be exactly like Mark, kind and hardworking and devoted to family. And I want them to have a grandmother who spoils them rotten and teaches them that they can accomplish anything with determination and smart planning. In that case, I said, I think we're going to get along just fine. The evening wound down around midnight, with Mark and Clarissa leaving in a shower of rice and rose petals for their honeymoon in Italy. A trip that Clarissa's parents had given them as a wedding gift, which was thoughtful and appropriate and didn't involve depleting anyone's retirement savings. As the last guests departed and the catering staff finished cleaning up, I walked through my new property, turning off lights and making sure everything was secure. The ballroom was empty now except for the lingering scent of flowers and the echo of laughter, but it felt warm and welcoming in a way it never had during the planning stages. Harold Pemberton had left me a thick folder of information about running the venue, vendor contracts, maintenance schedules, booking procedures, financial records. It was overwhelming but also exciting. At 61, I was starting a completely new career, one that would let me help other families celebrate their most important moments. But more importantly, I was starting a new relationship with my son and daughter-in-law, one built on mutual respect instead of obligation and guilt. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark. Thank you for saving my wedding and my marriage and probably my soul. I love you, Mom. I smiled and typed back. I love you too. Now go enjoy your honeymoon and let me figure out how to run a business. 6 months later, Willowbrook Manor had become the most sought-after wedding venue in the county. Clarissa turned out to have an incredible eye for design and a natural talent for working with nervous brides and complicated family dynamics. Mark handled all our marketing and social media, and bookings were solid for the next 18 months. But the best part wasn't the business success. The best part was the Sunday dinners at my new house, where Mark and Clarissa would arrive with groceries and stories about their week, and we'd cook together and argue about politics and plan improvements to the venue. The best part was watching Clarissa learn to make my grandmother's biscuits, standing beside me in the kitchen and asking questions about Mark's childhood while Flower dusted both our aprons. The best part was having my son back. 3 months after the wedding, Mark came to Sunday dinner with a small wrapped box and a nervous expression. "What's this?" I asked, accepting the package. "It's a thank you gift," he said, "for teaching me what really matters." Inside the box was a simple silver necklace with a small pendant. A tiny house with the words "Home is where Mom" is engraved on the back. "I saw it and thought about how you gave up everything to make sure I had a home," he said. "And then I realized that home was never a place. Home was you, taking care of me and believing in me, and loving me even when I didn't deserve it." I put on the necklace immediately and wore it every day after that. A reminder that sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be bought with money. They can only be earned through love and sacrifice and the willingness to fight for what matters most. A year later, Mark and Clarissa announced they were expecting their first child. When they told me the news over Sunday dinner, Clarissa reached across the table and took my hand. "We want you to be very involved," she said. "We want our children to grow up knowing how lucky they are to have a grandmother who teaches them that love means action, not just words." "And," Mark added with a grin, "we're hoping you'll consider moving into the guest house behind the manor. That way you'll be close to the business and close to us when the baby comes." I looked around the dining room of my beautiful venue, at the young couple who had become not just my family but my business partners and closest friends, and I realized that sometimes the most devastating betrayals can lead to the most unexpected blessings. "I think," I said, "that sounds perfect." The baby was born 8 months later, a little girl they named Eleanor Rose, after her grandmother and the flowers that bloomed in the manor gardens every spring. She was perfect, with Mark's dark eyes and what appeared to be her mother's determined chin, and when I held her for the first time in the hospital room, she wrapped her tiny fingers around my thumb like she was making a promise. "Tell her about the dandelions, Grandma," Mark said, sitting beside me with his arm around Clarissa, both of them glowing with new parent exhaustion and joy. So I did. I told little Eleanor about the boy who used to bring me weeds because he thought they were beautiful, who used to dance on my feet in the kitchen, who grew up to be a man who understood that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or earned, they could only be given freely with an open heart and steady hands. And as I spoke, I realized that every sacrifice I'd made, every difficult year of raising Mark alone, every dollar I'd spent on his education and his future, every moment of doubt and exhaustion and worry, all of it had led to this. To holding my granddaughter in a room full of people who loved each other fiercely and unconditionally. To a family that understood that home isn't a place you buy. It's a feeling you build, one day at a time, with patience and forgiveness and the absolute refusal to let money or status or other people's expectations matter more than love. The venue thrived, our family grew stronger, and I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't hurting the people who hurt you. It's building something so beautiful and meaningful that their betrayal becomes just the beginning of your real story. Mark never made me sleep in my car again. In fact, he made sure I never slept anywhere but the most comfortable bed in the most beautiful house, surrounded by people who valued me not for what I could provide, but for who I was and who I'd helped them become. And every morning when I woke up in my elegant guest house behind Willowbrook Manor, I looked out at the gardens where couples came to promise their lives to each other, where families gathered to celebrate love and commitment and the promise of forever, and I knew that I had built something lasting. Not just a business but a legacy. Not just a venue, but a home where love was always the most important thing on the menu. Sometimes people ask me if I regret spending my retirement savings on a moment of righteous anger, if I wish I'd handled things differently. The answer is simple. I regret nothing. Every penny was worth it to get my son back, to build a relationship with my daughter-in-law, to create a business that brings joy to other families, and to teach the next generation that love is something you do, not something you say. Besides, the venue has been profitable from day one. My investment has tripled in value, and I've never been happier or more fulfilled in my life. Turns out that sometimes the best financial decision you can make is to invest in dignity, respect, and the absolute refusal to let anyone, even family, treat you as less than you're worth. Money, as it turns out, really can buy happiness. You just have to be smart enough to spend it on the things that actually matter.